Hi there. Welcome back to Intentional Money Moves Live. For those who don't know me, I'm Leah Hadley, and I am so glad that you're here with me today. If you're new, welcome. We've been doing this series now every Monday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We are talking about real life. We're talking about real money, real questions, and getting rid of the jargon. If you're here for the first time, let me know that you're watching, whether you are watching live or you're watching the replay. It's always nice to know who's here. And I just want to thank those of you who I gave you a little bit of homework last week, and some of you did it and reached out to me, which just put such a smile on my face. We'll talk a little bit about it in a minute. But I just want to know that I want you to know how much I appreciate it when you guys do interact and reach out and ask your questions. So then I really know how I can support you better. So the series that we've been working on over the last few weeks is called Inflation Decoded. So last Monday, we actually talked about how to decode the headlines, and I give you 4 questions to run any financial headline through. And the first one was, is this a level or a change compared to what, right? Whose average is it? Does it ask anything of me today? And I told you to run the practice last Wednesday because the July inflation report came out Wednesday morning. So let's start there. For those of you who maybe missed it or whatever, no worries at all. We're going to talk through it right now. And I think it's a great example of exactly what I was talking about last week, which was perfect. So let's kind of walk through the numbers together. So what was the inflation number that came back? It was 3.4%. So what does that mean? Inflation over the last 12 months was 3.4%. And remember, the month before that, it was 3.5%. Okay, so let's look at the questions. Is that level or change? Well, it's both, really, right? And that's exactly why we saw kind of split coverage if you looked at the various reports that were out there. But 3.4% is the level, and that's down from 3.5%. So that's the change, right? So sure enough, some outlets led with the cooling and some led with still above target, but they were talking about the same report. And some of you caught that on your own, which I loved. I loved hearing from you, to hear that you maybe even just a couple of weeks ago would have thought that was just noise. But now that you've been listening and paying attention, you're really starting to understand these reports, which is fantastic. Now, here's the part that almost nobody led with. In that same report, energy prices fell 1.5% for the month, which might sound great, but over the last 12 months, energy is up almost 15%, 14.7%, and gasoline specifically 24.6%. So 1 month down, 1 year way up. Same category, same report, right? So that's the idea here. So really make sure we're really paying attention to what these numbers mean, right? So the headline says inflation eased. Your gas tank may feel different, right? And so those are the things where it can feel very conflicting or confusing to hear something and feel something very different in your life. And that's really what we're talking about here, right? There's actually a whole category of price increases that don't even show up in the CPI, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But before we do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about shrinkflation. Now, that's one that most people tend to be a little bit more familiar with, right? Shrinkflation, for anybody who may not be familiar, is when the price of a good stays the same on the shelf, but the package gets smaller, right? So it's like losing volume over time. Same price, less product is what it comes down to, right? So if you look at the price per ounce, for example, like on the shelf sticker, you may see the price per ounce going up while the overall package of that good stayed the same, right? And here's what I want you to understand about why companies do this instead of just raising the price, because once you get it, you can't really unsee it, right? We as consumers are actually very sensitive to price, but as consumers, most of us are relatively blind to size. Okay. So if your cereal goes from like $4.99 a box to $5.49, most people actually do notice that change. But if the ounces in that same box of cereal go from like 19.3 ounces to 18.1 ounces, most people are never going to notice that, right? So you start to like buy cereal a little bit more frequently. But for a lot of people, they kind of internalize the blame of that, if you will, or maybe blame their kids, depending. But let's kind of walk through that math because I think it's important. 19.3 ounces down to 18.1. That's about 6% less cereal. And the price didn't change, right? So what you're actually paying per ounce, that went up about 6.5%. That's the real increase. And that increase just didn't show up in the price tag. Okay. Now, I want to correct something because there's a version of this going around online that isn't accurate, and I don't want you carrying a wrong idea around. Okay. People online do say that shrinkflation is how the government hides inflation, that the CPI is missing it. It does not. Okay. The CPI does not miss it. We will talk in a minute about what the CPI does miss, but shrinkflation is not one of those things, right? The Bureau of Labor Statistics, when a package shrinks and the price holds, they adjust the price they collect to account for that smaller quantity. Okay. And that is what goes into the index. So that does actually account for that. So that's not why the official number may feel wrong, right? Like that's not the gap. What it does explain is something different though. And for most of us as consumers, I think it's a little bit more useful. It explains why the increase feels invisible in your kitchen, right? But in reality, you notice that you're having to buy cereal more frequently, right? Now, the best thing to do, and honestly, I still remember as a kid when the grocery store changed, the grocery store that we went to when I was a kid, used to have the price on the actual item. But I remember when they started putting the prices on the shelves and it had the per unit price. I still remember learning that. And honestly, it's the only number that I look at as a consumer when I compare things when I'm at a store. I'm always looking at that price. So if that's not something that you currently look at, maybe you want to just start paying a little bit more attention to it, right? Because that's where you're going to be able to very clearly see any kind of change in the price per item, per ounce, right? Whatever the per unit is. And honestly, we see it hiding in, jars, boxes, lots of processed goods, paper products, things like that, canned goods. And when we talk about pillars, right? When we talk about the intentional money pillars and what pillar are we talking about right now? We're really talking about clarity, right? And I want to name that because clarity doesn't ask you to fix anything. It just asks you to pay attention, right? And so when we're talking about shrinkflation, I'm really just talking about I want you to be mindful and paying attention and build some awareness, okay? The next one we're going to talk about is a little sneakier, okay? And it's called skimpflation. Now, skimpflation is when the size holds, the price also holds, but whatever you're buying, the thing that you're buying is getting like more cheaply made, right? Or if it's a service, maybe the service got thinner, right? So with shrinkflation, something measurable changed, but it's hard to find it, honestly, right? You're not going to see it on the price per ounce on the shelf. You're not going to see it on the package, right? It's actually a different product inside. So in goods, most of the time it's going to be an ingredient substitution, right? Less of a more costly ingredient, more of like a cheaper filler, right? The cookie has less butter, right? The sauce has less of whatever it made it taste like the thing, right? In services, it's even more familiar, right? If we think about like hotels, if any of you have stayed in hotels recently, most of them are no longer cleaning your room every day unless you're actually requesting it, right? Maybe a restaurant that you would go to has reduced their workforce. That might be, impacting the service. So things like that. And a survey out this year found that more than 40% of consumers have noticed that quality has dropped. Specifically, things that were identified were grocery products, restaurants, fast food, and clothing. So 40% is a pretty big number, right? That's not just like a one-off complaint here or there, okay? So if you want to check for it, there's a couple ways that you can do it. First, if we're talking about goods, the ingredient list, right? Ingredients are listed by weight. And so the order kind of helps you understand the recipe of the good that you are purchasing, right? So if something that you used to have like a particular ingredient listed first or second, and now that ingredient is fifth or sixth, right? That recipe has changed, right? Now it may not have changed your experience with the product, but it may have, right? And you don't have to understand any of the chemistry to understand that just the order is telling you that there's been a change in the recipe of a particular good, right? But secondly, just trust your own experience, right? Like I think about some of the places that I purchased clothing when the kids were younger, where I was perfectly happy, making those purchases, but have since found that their clothing items no longer wash the same way that they did, right? They're just not as good of material. The quality has gone down. And really trust your own experience, right? Because a lot of times we can't necessarily, like in the ingredients in an item of processed food, yes, we can see those ingredients. We're not going to always be able to see, but if you are the one who's using these products on a regular basis and you're noticing a difference, that should be telling you something, right? Now, here's where I do want to be straight with you, because this is different from the first part that we were talking about, right? Size, we were talking about shrinkflation to start with, right? And I see some people joined us. So just say hello when you come in. Let us know where you're watching from. It's always nice to know who's here. And again, if you're watching the replay, let me know that as well. But shrinkflation, we can definitely catch in the CPI. The quality conversation that I was just talking about, the skimpflation, there are methods for adjusting for quality changes, and they do get used, but they're applied very, very narrowly. Okay. So a product that is quietly getting worse without changing size, that is typically not getting captured in the numbers that are getting reported. So that really is a gap that you may be noticing and not hearing in the numbers, right? Not like a definitional misunderstanding like we talked about last week, but that's an actual limitation around how these numbers are measured, which means like you feel like your money buys less than the official number says it should. And honestly, part of that feeling is legitimate, right? It's not in the data, but you are absolutely not wrong. You're measuring something that the index just isn't very good at measuring. Okay. Now, this one really runs into the values pillar of the intentional money method. That's our second pillar, right? You can't fight skimpflation with a spreadsheet, right? There's no unit price to focus your disappointment on, if you will, right? What you can do is you can decide where are you going to invest for quality, and when quality drops, when are you going to choose to no longer spend in that way, right? And that's a values decision. That's about what matters to you, what your priorities are, what's important to you. That's going to look different from your friend or your family member or your neighbor or whomever, okay? Now, for those of you who are watching, either live or if you're watching the replay, if you have experienced this, I would love to hear. In one of our Empowered Sisterhood community chats, we were talking a little bit about how products have changed over the years. And it was really interesting to notice and hear which ones were impacting different people in different ways. So if you are watching live, or if you want to, if you're watching the replay, share in the chat where you're noticing some changes to some of the products that you're buying. Okay. But this is the one that actually matters. This third section, this is the part that actually matters. Okay. So stay with me here, because this is the big one. Your cereal box has a shelf tag, right? Your paycheck does not. Okay. So 2 weeks ago, I mentioned a number in passing, and I said that we would come back to it. So here we are. In the July jobs report, average hourly earnings rose 3.2% over the last year. And as of last Wednesday, the inflation report was 3.4%, right? So 3.2% compared to 3.4%. So wages growing slower than prices. So what does that mean in real terms, right? For your average person, that means that real wages took a step back. And I'm not extrapolating that from two numbers, right? The government publishes it directly. The same Wednesday morning the inflation report came out, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released something called real earnings, right? Real average hourly earnings fell 0.2% from July of last year to July of just this year, okay? And there's one more layer in that release, and I think, honestly, it's kind of like the most I don't know, like quietly devastating line in the whole report, if you will. Okay. And that is that real average weekly earnings, I'm going to say this correctly, real average weekly earnings rose 0.1% over the year. So weekly pay held up, barely, but held up. But the average work week got longer by 0.3%. Okay. Hourly pay lost ground, weekly pay stayed flat, but the only reason it stayed flat is that people were actually working more hours. Okay. Now that really is the mood of what we are seeing in the economy right now. And it's why so many of you tell me that you feel like you're running harder, but you're still standing still. You're right. You are running harder. And it is feeling frustrating that you may not be moving forward in the way you want to, right? So I think national averages are helpful for you to know for context. If you're on our email list, in the email reminder that went out about today's session, I also included a handout in there for you where you can calculate your own personal numbers. Let me see how hard it is for me to share this because I think this is a really helpful. I'm not sure how this particular tool shares. Oh, here. I think I can pull it right up. Maybe. Okay. Here is the handout that goes with this. And this is the section that I want to point you to specifically. Is this your paycheck section? So you can really calculate that out for yourself. I think that will be really helpful for a lot of folks. I think I stopped sharing. Yeah. But let's just kind of walk through. I'll just use a sample number. Let's say you make $70,000 a year and you got a 3% raise. That raise would be $2,100, right? And that's a reasonable raise, right? For most people, most people feel pretty good about making, over $2,000 more a year, right? But if prices went up 3.4% to buy exactly the life that you had last year, the exact same one, no upgrades whatsoever, the actual increase you would need based on the numbers that we've been talking about is $2,380. Okay. So in real numbers, in the context of this conversation, you're $280 behind, right? On a raise that for most people, they would have been really happy about and nothing went wrong, right? You didn't do anything wrong. You weren't feeling undisciplined. You got a raise, which is fantastic. But still the real growth went backwards, right? And so that's where you're feeling it, right? And that can compound, right? If you allow that to happen over the years, that can compound significantly over time. And it's not like you ever made a bad decision or anything, right? But it will reduce to a meaningfully different standard of living if you allow it to compound, right? So let's talk about what pillars these are as it relates to the intentional money method, right? Knowing your numbers, and I'm walking through that worksheet specifically, what are your numbers? That's clarity, okay? Clarity is just that. It's just, doing the arithmetic, right? Looking at the answer, don't look away, right? It's not asking you to fix anything. It's just asking you, how have your wages changed over the last year? How have expenses changed over the last year? Let's compare them, okay? That's it. Now, mindset is what happens next, okay? And it shows up in two different directions. The first one is whether you're open to growing your income, right? Because if expenses are going up faster than your wages, right? Most people's natural instinct is to cut back. But I want to start with, are you open to your income growing? Now, for a lot of us, that can genuinely feel uncomfortable, right? For a lot of people, asking for more, charging for more, even believing that there's more available to you than what you currently have can feel uncomfortable. So if your gut reaction to a negative number was, well, that's just what I make, I want you to pay attention to that. Okay. That's actually not a fact about your job. That may be what you make, but it is a belief. And I just want you to be aware that that belief exists. Okay. The second one is quieter. And really, that's what I mostly see. If your only response to falling behind is, I'm just going to reduce my spending, I'm just going to cut more, that's also mindset. Okay. So spending is the lever that we reach for because it's the only one that feels like it's ours to control. And I kind of hesitated on that word feels because it is definitely a feeling, right? But deciding ahead of time that expenses are the only lever, that's actually a decision that you may have made without even being aware of it. And I understand why. I do get it, right? Cutting feels responsible, right? And for a lot of people, asking for more can feel greedy. A lot of us grew up, on don't want too much, just be grateful for what you have. And that belief absolutely protected somebody in a very meaningful way at some point or another, right? But it doesn't have to run your life now. Okay. Strategy is the pillar where you actually pick. Now, sometimes the answer really is spending, and sometimes it's income, but most of the time, it's some combination of both. Okay. And it's a combination that fits your individual life, not somebody else's formula. That's not what this is about, right? As I say in the book, Intentional Money, The Modern Woman's Guide to Building Wealth, Purpose, and Peace, strategy without mindset does not work. But mindset without strategy, that's just a wish. So a practical thing. If your real raise came out negative on that handout, I do want that number to be part of your next compensation conversation. And then not as a complaint, okay? But simply as a fact, as arithmetic, right? There is a real difference between walking in and saying, hey, I'd like more money, and walking in and saying, my compensation declined in real terms this year, and I want to talk about how we can correct that, right? One is a statement about the economy, right? It's not about feeling bad for yourself, right? It's about what's happening in the broader market. Everybody's operating, right, in this context. All right. So now you've got the 3 checks, and I want to be careful here because I can feel the trap coming, right? For some of you lovely, amazing, fantastic type A people, the trap is you go home and audit everything, right? You're taking pictures of like the price tags on shelves and the ingredient lists and things like that. Okay. But here's the thing. And I want you to really pay attention to this because it's deliberately backwards from how a lot of attention these kinds of things get online. All right. The pantry stuff, the easy stuff to look at, it's real and it is worth paying attention to, but it's small. It really is small. Catching shrinkflation on the things you buy weekly, it's going to save you maybe, a few dollars here and there. The quality stuff is really a values decision. It's not as much of a math decision, right? Pick the things where quality is really, really important to you and protect those and let the rest go, right? But where the big money is in this conversation is around your paycheck. That's the one that's worth having the uncomfortable conversation, right? And that's the one that gets such a small fraction of attention. It's easy to point to a shrinking cereal box, right? But I really want you to focus on where you're going to see the biggest impact for yourself from a financial standpoint, right? If we're making intentional money moves, we're being intentionally making intentional decisions about our money. Put your energy where you're going to get the biggest result, right? So a couple of things this week. Take a look at that handout. We'll also send it out with the recording, and there'll be a link with the video if you're not on our email list, so you can absolutely get a copy of that. But I do want to encourage you to do the math on at least the paycheck, and just see where you're at and see if that's something that would be helpful to talk about with your employer. All right, now next Monday, episode 4 of the series, and this is one that changes how you're going to look at your own balance sheet, okay? We're going to talk about who inflation helps. We're going to talk about who inflation hurts because it's genuinely not evenly distributed, right? Debt behaves one way. When prices increase, savings actually behave the opposite way, right? Most people are on both sides of that and have never looked to see from a net standpoint, which side they're on. So once you can see it, you can really position yourself instead of just being kind of at the whim of what's happening around you, right? And then for the last episode in this series, week 5, we're going to bring the whole series together into an actual plan, right? Including the honest conversation about what you do when your income is not keeping pace, which after today, I'm hoping that a lot of us are going to be more mindful of. And here's the one thing I want you to walk away with today. For 3 weeks now, the theme has been the same. And it's really about inflation. If that's the gap between the official story and your actual life, right, is not evidence that something is wrong with you, right? This is what is actually happening. Week 1, we learned what the number actually measures. Week 2, we talked about the headlines, how they get written, right? Today, we talked about how can you see where price changes are happening that may be less obvious, right? In your cupboard, in the product itself, in your paycheck. Things are changing, right? The economy is dynamic. That's not a discipline problem. It never was a discipline problem. How many of you have been giving yourselves a hard time if you feel like you're not making the progress you want to make, right? So I want to just really encourage you to think about money differently, right? I don't ever want to hear I'm bad with money, right? I don't want to hear I'm behind. I want to hear I'm being intentional, right? I'm being thoughtful. I'm asking the questions. I'm making the decisions. Those are the pieces that are really empowering, right? So again, I'm going to include the link to the handout that goes with today's session. These are the kinds of conversations that we're having in our Empowered Sisterhood membership community, where people are talking about the real challenges that they're facing around money and how they're navigating them. They're preparing for the tough conversations so that way they feel more ready and grounded when they're having those conversations. And they're in community and celebrating the amazing results that they're having as a result of having those tough conversations. So if that is a room that you want to learn more about, I will include a link to the Empowered Sisterhood membership program information with this video. Reach out if you have any questions at all. We would love to have you in that room with us. And again, next week, we have episode 4 of our inflation series. We're going to be looking at who are the winners and losers and what might you not realize about how inflation may be impacting you. So I look forward to seeing you all next week.